October 1973. 6 years had passed since the swift biblical victory of the 1967 Six-Day War. Israel was living in a golden age of confidence, a sense of security, and near absolute superiority. The Israel Defense Forces, IDF, was more than a military force. It was a symbol, a living legend, admired around the world and feared by its neighbors. It was seen as an invincible military machine, an impenetrable shield manned by the smartest, bravest soldiers and equipped with the best weapons. The strategic buffer zones it had captured, the vast, desolate Sinai Peninsula from Egypt, the rugged, strategically valuable Golan Heights from Syria, and the historic West Bank from Jordan seemed to be natural fortresses, impregnable walls that would ensure that any future war would be fought on enemy soil, far from Israel's dense population centers. In particular, the Bar-Lev Line, a string of fortified concrete fortifications along the east bank of the Suez Canal, was promoted as a modern engineering marvel, a graveyard for any Egyptian army that dared to cross. This sense of security was reinforced and rationalized by a military and intelligence doctrine that had become almost dogma, an ideology that dominated the entire national security apparatus. It was known as Ha-Concepcia, the concept. And this concept, formulated and reinforced by the Military Intelligence Directorate, Amman, Israel's most powerful intelligence agency, rested on two main pillars, which were considered indisputable truths. Pillar 1, Syria, with its powerful military but lacking strategic depth, would never dare to launch a full-scale war against Israel without the simultaneous participation of Egypt. Any unilateral action by Damascus would be suicidal. Pillar 2, and the foundation of all subsequent miscalculations, Egypt, now under the leadership of President Anwar Sadat, would not launch a full-scale war until it had built a sufficiently powerful air force. Sufficiently powerful here means capable of launching devastating strikes deep into Israeli territory, neutralizing airfields, command centers, and especially crippling the powerful Israeli Air Force, IAF. Since Israeli intelligence, based on technical analysis, believes that Egypt is very far from achieving that capability, perhaps years away, the logical conclusion is war is unlikely in the near future. This concept became a distorting prism, an intellectual filter that filtered and reinterpreted all intelligence. It created an echo chamber within political and military leadership where skepticism was marginalized and contrary evidence was deemed unreliable. It was a veil that blinded almost an entire generation of leaders who led Israel to its glorious victory in 1967. However, they failed to understand Anwar Sadat, the successor to Gamal Abdel Nasser. An icon of Arab nationalism, Sadat was initially seen as a weak leader, a transitional figure. But inside, Sadat was a ruthless, pragmatic strategist. He did not seek a total military victory like Nasser. He understood that the total destruction of Israel was impossible. Yes, his goal was far more subtle and political, to launch a carefully planned, limited war aimed solely at breaking the no war, no peace stalemate that had crippled Egypt's economy and eroded his credibility. He needed to inflict enough damage, enough military and psychological shock on Israel to shatter its illusion of invincibility, forcing the Jewish state and the major powers to come to the negotiating table in earnest so that Egypt could reclaim the Sinai. In conjunction with Syrian President Hafez al-Assad, who had always intended to reclaim the Golan Heights, a coordinated attack plan, dubbed Operation Badr, was drawn up with a masterly level of military secrecy and deception. Maskirovka learned from their Soviet mentors, and then the omens began to appear. They were no longer faint signals, but loud alarm bells, misinterpreted or deliberately ignored. On October 4th, 1973, a highly unusual red alert flashed. Zvi Zamir, the head of the Mossad Foreign Intelligence Agency, a man with the predatory instincts and vast experience of a veteran spy, began to feel a deep unease that he could not explain. He received reports from his agents that all Soviet military advisors and their families had been suddenly and hastily airlifted out of both Egypt and Syria within 24 hours. No official explanation was given. This was an unprecedented move. Why would Moscow withdraw its experts, who operated the most sophisticated weapon systems, just before a potential conflict? The only logic was that they knew for sure that such a conflict was imminent and did not want their citizens caught in the crossfire or taken hostage. At the same time, a huge military air bridge was being set up in the opposite direction. Heavy transport aircraft were flying from Moscow and Eastern European countries straight to Damascus. carrying state-of-the-art military equipment, surface-to-air missiles, spare parts, and ammunition. Intelligence data clearly showed that the Arabs were preparing for something much bigger, far beyond the scope of a military exercise. But the concept remained, like a solid wall in a man's mind. Their analysts argued that this was just a staged political crisis between Cairo, Damascus, and Moscow, that the withdrawal was just a trick by Sadat to pressure the Soviet Union for more weapons, that the border buildup was merely an annual autumn exercise, albeit on a larger scale than usual, with a political purpose. They still insisted that Sadat was just showing off. The signs were as clear as day, but why were they ignored? A country renowned for its intelligence services, considered the world's masters, was now lulling itself into a stupor of its own past successes. The veil of complacency and pride was about to be torn mercilessly by the roar of thousands of tank engines and the explosion of tens of thousands of artillery shells. Israel was about to face the darkest and bloodiest hours of its young history, a bitter and eternal lesson in the price of complacency and rigidity in strategic thinking. On the night of October 5th, with less than 24 hours to go before the disaster, the evidence, which had become increasingly incontrovertible, poured in at the Israeli Defense Ministry headquarters in Tel Aviv, known as Kiryat. Israeli Air Force reconnaissance flights and images from US spy satellites revealed a military buildup on a scale far beyond any conventional military exercise in the past. Hundreds of thousands of Egyptian troops, thousands of T-55 and T-62 tanks, and artillery were closing in on the west bank of the Suez Canal. Engineer units moved heavy bridge-building equipment to the water's edge. Artillery batteries were placed on standby. To the north, the Syrian army had completed its deployment close to Israel's fragile defenses on the Golan Heights. SA-6, gainful mobile air defense missile systems, and ZSU-23-4, Shilka, self-propelled anti-aircraft artillery batteries, weapons that had proven extremely dangerous to low-flying aircraft during the Vietnam War, were deployed densely, forming an almost impenetrable anti-aircraft fire network. Yet the Israeli central government remained silent. The overconfidence that followed the resounding victory of 1967 had turned into arrogance, a fatal subjectivity. Israeli leaders, from military to political, blindly believed in the Bar-Lev line. They believed that their air force, with the most talented pilots in the world, could destroy any threat from the air. They believed in the concept as in a religious truth. In the intelligence apparatus, a secret but extremely fierce struggle was taking place. Mossad, under Zvi Zamir, was increasingly concerned about the possibility of war. Zamir, a pragmatist and not bound by rigid military doctrines, felt that there were too many unusual signs to ignore. But Ayman, headed by Major General Eli Zera, who held the sole role of assessing national intelligence, still firmly rejected the possibility. Zera was a typical product of the IDF, intelligent, decisive, but also rigid and absolutely convinced of the concept that his own agency had created. He and his analysts believed that Sadat did not have the military means to wage a successful war, and therefore would not dare to act. Any information to the contrary was dismissed or reinterpreted to fit the pre-existing concept. On the afternoon of October 5th, a dramatic event took place, one that could have changed history had it been handled differently. Mossad director Zvi Zamir received an urgent call from one of the most important, most valuable agents Israel had ever had in the Arab world. The identity of this man was kept strictly secret for decades, and has been the subject of countless debates. But later, many reputable sources revealed that it was Ashraf Marwan, son-in-law of former Egyptian President Gamal Abdel Nasser and a close, trusted advisor to President Anwar Sadat. Marwan, codenamed the Angel, had access to Egypt's deepest military and political secrets. Marwan requested an urgent meeting in London immediately, saying that he had vital information about an imminent attack. This was no ordinary warning. Realizing the unprecedented seriousness of the situation, Zamir did not hesitate. He bypassed all normal procedures, did not inform Zera, and immediately boarded a private plane to fly to Europe to meet his valuable source directly. The meeting took place at midnight in a safe house in London. Marwan confirmed the worst. Egypt and Syria would simultaneously attack Israel the following day, October 6th. War was inevitable. However, there was one fatal error in Marwan's information. He reported that the attack would begin at 6 p.m. at sunset, the time he believed would be most disadvantageous for the Israeli Air Force, which had to operate in twilight conditions. In fact, The Egyptian-Syrian command, in a move kept secret until the last minute even from senior officials, decided to bring the attack forward to 2 p.m. to create maximum surprise when the Israeli people were in the midst of the most important prayer period of Yom Kippur. It wasn't until 3:45 a.m. on October 6th, Yom Kippur, the holiest and most solemn day in the Jewish calendar, when Israel was virtually at a standstill, all public transportation was stopped and radio stations were silent, that Zvi Zamir finally called Tel Aviv. The call was routed directly to the office of IDF Chief of Staff General David Dado Elazar. Zamir's voice on the phone, though trying to remain calm, could not hide the urgency. The war will come today, in the evening. The news caused a genuine shock, a controlled panic at the top. An emergency meeting of the cabinet, including Meir's kitchen cabinet, was convened immediately. General Elazar, now convinced that war was imminent, recommended drastic preemptive action, a massive airstrike on Syrian airfields and army formations, repeating the tactics that had brought about the resounding victory of 1967. He argued that, despite the risks, this was the only way to minimize casualties and regain the initiative. However, Prime Minister Golda Meir, obsessed with maintaining US support, faced a painful decision. She received stern warnings from Washington via National Security Advisor Henry Kissinger that if Israel attacked first, it would be condemned by the world as the aggressor and would not receive a single shot from the United States. Backed into a corner, Meir made what was perhaps the most difficult decision of her career. She rejected Elazar's proposal. Israel would not fire first. It would suffer the first blow to show the world who the aggressor was. It was a decision that remains controversial to this day, one she later deeply regretted. It was just before noon on October 6th, when millions of Israelis were in their synagogues or at home in silent prayer, that the call to arms for the entire reserve force, the backbone of the Israeli military, was officially issued. But it was too late. Mobilizing, assembling, and deploying hundreds of thousands of soldiers and thousands of tanks takes time, at least 24 to 48 hours. Meanwhile, the regular units on the front lines are too thin, too stretched, and completely unprepared for an attack of this scale. In the final hours before the war, Israel's leaders tried to reassure the public and themselves. Prime Minister Golda Meir spoke on the radio. Her voice was still firm, still the voice of a resilient grandmother of the nation, but those who listened closely could detect an unusual restraint and anxiety hidden behind the forceful words. Citizens of Israel, she said, there is no doubt that we will win. But she also admitted frankly, although I believe that Egypt and Syria are acting very foolishly. The famous one-eyed General Moshe Dayan, a symbol of Israeli military might who became a living legend after 1967, was surprisingly optimistic, if not dangerously complacent. He admitted that the Israeli army was stretched thin along the Suez Canal, but asserted the Sinai Peninsula is so large that it can shield Israel's major cities. Dayan insisted confidently, almost arrogantly, the Egyptians will be driven out of Sinai as soon as our reserves enter the fight. As for Syria, they will never regain the Golan Heights. Those words, uttered just hours before the attack, quickly became a tragic testament to complacency, arrogance, and fatal errors in judgment. The reality of the battlefield that was to unfold would be far more brutal and terrifying than any scenario they could have imagined. An entire nation is about to enter a life-or-death test, a war not only to protect its territory, but also to protect its very survival. That's PM, October 6th, 1973. Across Israel, the solemn silence of Yom Kippur was shattered by a deafening sound, one that a generation of Israelis would never forget: the wailing of air raid sirens, echoing from Dan in the north to Eilat in the south. In synagogues, prayers were choked. On deserted streets, shock reigned. At the same time, on two fronts hundreds of miles apart, hell was unleashed with a coordination and ferocity that no Israeli intelligence analyst could have imagined. The coordinated Egyptian-Syrian offensive, codename Operation Badr, had begun. The battle was unfolding with an intensity and scale that far exceeded the worst predictions of Israel's leadership. The Arab strategy, conceived over many years and kept in absolute secrecy, was a masterpiece of planning, camouflage, and surprise. In Sinai, Egypt mobilized a huge force, 5 infantry divisions in the front line, with more than 120,000 soldiers, supported by 2,000 tanks and nearly 700 fighter planes. The initial artillery barrage, lasting almost an hour, completely paralyzed Israeli communications and command systems along the canal. Telephone lines were cut, antenna masts blown up. The Jewish soldiers in the Bar-Lev line fortifications were completely isolated, unaware of what was happening outside the rain of bombs and shells. As soon as the artillery fire ceased, the first wave of 8,000 Egyptian infantry, organized into commando and anti-tank teams, began crossing the 200-meter wide canal in hundreds of rubber Zodiac boats. They moved quickly and almost silently. Their first and arguably most difficult task was to breach the massive sand wall that Israel had built on the canal's eastern bank. This wall, which in some places was more than 20 meters high, was designed to stop any attack by tanks and armored vehicles. Israeli intelligence believed it would take the Egyptians at least 24 to 48 hours to breach it using conventional methods such as explosives or bulldozers, giving enough time for Israeli reserves to arrive. But the Egyptian engineers had prepared a surprise solution, an ingeniously simple but extremely effective method. They brought high-pressure water pumps made in England and Germany, mounted on small barges. They hooked up water hoses and sprayed powerful streams of water directly at the sand wall. Under the force of the water, the sand and clay quickly turned to mud and were washed down the canal. In just 3 to 5 hours, they had opened more than 60 passages through the sand wall, a feat the Israelis considered impossible. Meanwhile, Egyptian naval commandos had been secretly diving through the canal in advance, finding and disabling oil pipelines that Israel planned to burn to create a sea of fire on the canal's surface, a defense plan that Egypt was well aware of. In less than a day, the Egyptian army had accomplished the extraordinary. They built more than 10 sturdy, heavy PMP pontoon bridges, allowing hundreds of T-55, T-62 tanks and armored vehicles to rush across the canal, establishing solid bridgeheads on the Sinai Peninsula several kilometers deep. The Bar-Lev line, the pride of Israel's 300 million diameter symbol of its security, collapsed quickly and disastrously. 16 concrete fortresses, called Ma'ozim, each manned by only a few dozen soldiers, were completely isolated. Surrounded by thousands of Egyptian troops, they fought bravely but hopelessly. Most of the fortresses were destroyed one by one or forced to surrender within a few days. As for the regular Israeli armored units sent in to counterattack in panic, they ran straight into a deadly trap that had been set. The Israeli armored brigades, accustomed to mastering the desert in mobile warfare, were faced with a new enemy they were completely unprepared for. Well-organized and well-armed anti-tank infantry, thousands of Egyptian soldiers armed with Sagar, AT-3 wire-guided anti-tank missiles, and Soviet-made RPG-7 anti-tank guns, dug into trenches they had dug as soon as they landed on the east bank. As the Israeli tanks charged, without infantry support, they unleashed a hail of missiles. The multi-million-dollar Patton and Centurion tanks, the pride of the IDF, became steel coffins. Sagar gunners, sitting kilometers away, calmly guided the missile with a small joystick until it hit its target. For the Israeli tankers, it was a nightmare. They could not see the enemy attacking them. In just the first 2 days, the Israeli 252nd Armored Division was almost wiped out, losing more than 200 of its 290 tanks. At the same time, in the air, the Israeli Air Force, IAF, was also painfully helpless. Egypt's SA-6 mobile anti-aircraft missile batteries and ZSU-23-4 self-propelled anti-aircraft guns, deployed densely, created a deadly fire umbrella covering the entire canal area, extending as far as 15 kilometers into Sinai. Any Israeli aircraft flying into this area to support the ground forces were greeted by a barrage of missiles. Israel's electronic countermeasures proved ineffective against this new generation of Soviet missiles. In just the first 2 days, the IAF lost dozens of modern F-4 Phantom and A-4 Skyhawk fighters. The air power, which was Israel's trump card, its guardian angel, was broken. Defense Minister Moshe Dayan, after flying over the front line by helicopter and witnessing the destruction of his tanks, fell into a state of despair and collapse. At a cabinet meeting, he made a historic statement expressing the utter panic of the leadership. This is the destruction of the Third Temple. He even mentioned the possibility of using nuclear weapons as a last resort. If the Sinai was a tactical shock, the situation in the north was much more strategically dire. The Golan Heights, with its rugged terrain overlooking the Hula Valley and the Sea of Galilee, was the key to defending all of northern Israel. Once breached, The road to Israel's major cities and settlements would be wide open, and the defenses there were alarmingly fragile. The entire plateau was held by only 2 Israeli armored brigades, the 7th in the north and the Barak Brigade in the south, with a total of about 180 tanks. They faced 3 Syrian mechanized infantry divisions, with a total of nearly 400 modern T-55 and T-62 tanks. The force ratio was nearly 8 to 1, an unthinkable number in modern warfare. Covered by an artillery barrage even denser than that on the Suez front, the Syrian army poured into the Golan like a flood. In the first hours, they broke through the fragile Israeli defenses in many places. In the southern Golan, the Barak Brigade fought bravely but was completely outnumbered. They were cut off, surrounded, and almost destroyed. The brigade commander and most of the commanding officers were killed. Syrian forces quickly captured the area and began advancing down the mountainside, threatening to strike the Sea of Galilee, a scenario that could have cut off northern Israel. At sea, the Syrian Navy also surprised with its fleet of Russian-equipped Komar-class missile boats. They quickly advanced to the Sea of Galilee, threatening coastal settlements, causing unprecedented panic among the Israeli population, who had never thought war could come so close. However, in the northern Golan, one of the most legendary and bloody tank battles in world military history took place. In a vast valley near the city of Quneitra, a place that would later be etched into military history as the Valley of Tears, the Israeli 7th Armored Brigade, under the command of Colonel Avigdor Yanush Ben-Gal, carried out an almost unbelievable suicide defense. With only about 100 tanks, the 7th Brigade faced the Syrian 7th Armored Division and part of the 3rd Armored Division, with a total of nearly 500 tanks and hundreds of armored vehicles. For 4 days and nights of relentless fighting, in fog and cold rain, the Israeli tankers fought to the last bullet and to the limit of human endurance. Lieutenant Colonel Avigdor Kahalani, a battalion commander and hero of the Six-Day War, became the soul of the defense. When his tank was burned, he jumped to another and continued to command, rallying the remaining tanks to stop the stormy Syrian attacks. They used the terrain intelligently, hiding behind mounds only to emerge, fire a precise shot at the T-62s at long range, and then quickly retreat to cover. They moved constantly to create the illusion of more tanks than there actually were. At the worst point, the entire defending force was down to only 7 combat-capable tanks, but they did not retreat, forming a final steel barrier. Their incredibly stubborn resistance significantly slowed and eventually completely broke the Syrian spearhead, buying precious time for Israeli reserves to arrive at the front. In the first 48 to 72 hours of the war, Israel was completely passive, suffering unprecedented losses in both men and equipment. The myth of invincibility had completely collapsed. An entire nation held its breath, worried about its own survival. The dream of a quick victory had evaporated, replaced by the brutal reality of a bloody war of attrition, a war that, for the first time, they were not sure they could win. On the evening of October 7th, after more than 48 hours of hell, when the darkness of despair had enveloped the entire land of Israel, the first faint but tenacious rays of hope began to appear. The Israeli war machine, though late in its start and sluggish in its shock, was finally in motion. The reserve mobilization system, one of the most efficient in the world, was operating with frantic urgency. Across the country, synagogues were transformed into rallying centers. Hundreds of thousands of men of all ages, from university professors to farmers to bank clerks, left their families and jobs behind, donned their old uniforms, and poured into their units. A massive exodus by every means possible, from public buses to private cars, towards the 2 burning fronts. The flow of tanks and armored personnel carriers on the highways began to reverse. No longer small units rushing to the front, but mighty divisions, a river of steel rushing toward Sinai and the Golan. The wind had begun to change direction. In the Golan Heights, where collapse was just a hair's breadth away, the arrival of reserve divisions brought about an almost immediate and decisive change. The Syrian army, after the first days of stormy success, began to reveal the fatal weaknesses of its Soviet-style military doctrine: rigidity in command, inflexibility in changing situations, and a cumbersome, vulnerable logistics system. It failed to capitalize on its initial advantage to completely destroy Israel's fragile defenses and rush down the Hula Valley. That hesitation bought Israel time, a gift more precious than gold. The Israelis, massively reinforced and regrouped, launched a fierce counterattack across the entire front on the morning of October 8th. Under the command of experienced generals such as Moshe Musa Peled and Dan Lehner, the Israeli armored divisions, now superior in numbers, began to push the Syrians back. The battle was extremely fierce. Every volcanic hill, every trail on the plateau became a target of bloody contention. It was no longer a desperate defense, but a ruthless and methodical attack. The Israeli tankers, with their superior shooting skills and better coordination, dominated the battlefield. By October 10th, after just 3 days of relentless counteroffensive, the Israeli army had achieved the unthinkable. Not only had they completely driven tens of thousands of Syrian troops and more than 1,000 tanks from the entire Golan Heights, pushing them back to their original starting lines, but they had also recaptured the strategic observation post on Mount Hermon in a daring raid by the Golani Paratrooper Brigade. The eye of the nation had been reopened. Now, what with the Syrian army on the verge of disintegration and retreat in disarray, a major strategic question was posed to Golda Meir's war cabinet. Should they stop at the old border, the Purple Line, or continue their advance into Syrian territory? This was one of the most important decisions of the war. Defense Minister Moshe Dayan, still haunted by the terrible losses of the early days, was vehemently opposed. He feared a trap, increased casualties, and international political complications. He argued that the goal of the war was simply to restore the situation before October 6th. However, Chief of Staff David Elazar, supported by his field commanders, made a sharp military argument. He argued that if Syria stopped at the border, it would give them time to reorganize and launch another attack. It was necessary to deal a knockout blow, one strong enough to knock them out of the war, allowing Israel to concentrate all its efforts on the Sinai front, where the situation was still very complicated and dangerous. After a heated debate, Prime Minister Golda Meir sided with Elazar. She ordered the attack. On October 11th, the Israeli army crossed the Purple Line and began advancing deep into Syrian territory. They created a strategic salient, called the Sasa Salient, which aimed straight at Damascus. By October 14th, Israeli 175mm Renault 7 long-range artillery units were able to target the suburbs of the capital Damascus, only about 40 kilometers away. They began shelling, causing panic in the city. This direct threat forced Syria to withdraw its most elite units, including Republican Guard armored brigades, to defend the capital. At the same time, the Arab world rushed to Syria's rescue. Iraq sent an armored division and an infantry division, while Jordan also sent its elite 40th Armored Brigade. However, these expeditionary forces, due to lack of coordination with the Syrian army and unfamiliarity with the terrain, were intercepted and inflicted heavy losses by waiting Israeli units. The northern front, although still seeing fierce fighting, was basically stabilized in Israel's favor. If the counterattack in the Golan was relatively quick and decisive, the road to victory on the Sinai front was much more arduous, bloody, and complicated. On October 8th, the Israeli army, under pressure to act quickly, hastily launched a major counterattack in the hope of repeating the success of 1967 and pushing the Egyptians back across the canal. However, this counterattack was poorly organized, lacking accurate intelligence, and above all, lacking basic coordination between armor, infantry, and air force. The result was a total disaster. Israeli armored brigades, without accompanying infantry to destroy anti-tank teams, once again ran straight into the Egyptian anti-aircraft missile umbrella and Sagar ambushes. Hundreds of Israeli tanks were destroyed in a single day. This defeat was a second cold shower on the Israeli command, forcing them to bitterly admit that the old tactics had completely failed. After the disastrous defeat on October 8th, a relative lull took place on the front. This was not peace, but a brutal war of attrition, with artillery duels and small-scale battles taking place daily. Both sides consolidated their forces and prepared for the decisive phase. On the Israeli side, a bold, creative, and extremely risky plan began to take shape. The person who initiated and promoted this plan most strongly was Major General Ariel Arik Sharon, commander of the 143rd Armored Division. Sharon, a legendary but also controversial general due to his autocratic personality, disobedience to orders, and frequent conflicts with his superiors, proposed a gamble of win all or lose nothing when The plan was to find a gap between the two Egyptian armies, the second in the north and the third in the south, in the area of the Great Bitter Lake, where the line between the two was considered weakest. From there, secretly send a force across the Suez Canal from east to west, striking the Egyptian rear. Once on the West Bank, this force would have two main tasks: fan out to destroy the SAM batteries from behind, where they were least protected, to puncture the air defense umbrella, and cut off the supply lines of the Egyptian armies fighting in the Sinai. If successful, it would completely change the course of the war. If it failed, the division crossing the canal would be isolated and destroyed. The Israeli High Command, hesitant to take the risk, did not immediately approve this plan. The golden opportunity came on 14th October. Under heavy pressure from Syria, which was under heavy attack, President Sadat made a serious tactical mistake. He ordered his strategic reserve armored divisions, which had been kept on the West Bank, to cross the canal and advance beyond the SAM umbrella to attack deeper into the Sinai, hoping to relieve the pressure on Syria. Immediately, hundreds of Egyptian T-62 and T-55 tanks became easy prey for the Israeli Air Force and armored units waiting in carefully prepared ambush positions. The tank battle of 14 October was one of the largest in history since the Battle of Kursk, with nearly 2,000 tanks involved. The result was a disastrous defeat for Egypt. They lost more than 250 tanks in a single day without achieving any significant objectives, while Israeli losses were negligible. This Egyptian defeat opened the door for an Israeli counterattack. That evening, Ariel Sharon received the green light. On the night of October 15th, the crossing, codenamed Operation Stout-Hearted Men, officially began. Ariel Sharon's division led the attack. However, to reach the planned crossing point, they had to pass through a complex of irrigation works and roads called China Farm, a name Israel mistakenly gave to a former Japanese agricultural project. Israeli intelligence had mistakenly judged the area to be only lightly defended. In fact, it was home to the 16th Infantry Division and a brigade of the Egyptian 21st Armored Division. It became a veritable slaughterhouse, one of the bloodiest and most chaotic battles of the war. The Egyptians put up an extremely tenacious and courageous resistance. The battle for China Farm lasted for 3 days and nights without a break, with close quarters fighting involving rocket-propelled grenades, and even bayonets. Both sides suffered terrible casualties, but in the end, with iron determination, the Israelis captured the vital corridor leading to the canal. While the battle for China Farm was still raging, a small force of paratroopers under Colonel Danny Matt successfully crossed the canal in rubber boats and established a small but crucial bridgehead on the West Bank. Soon after, engineers, working under constant artillery fire, performed a feat, assembling a giant pontoon bridge in a matter of hours. Now the tables were turned. Tanks and armored vehicles from the divisions led by Sharon and later Abraham Adan began pouring across the canal. Once on the West Bank, free from the threat of SAMs, they rampaged through the Egyptian rear with almost no resistance. They split into several columns, one heading north, destroying a series of SA-2, SA-3, SA-6 missile launchers from behind. The Egyptian air defense umbrella was torn apart. The Israeli Air Force now had control of the skies over Sinai. The other force moved south, attacking command posts, logistics depots, and, most importantly, cutting off all land routes to Suez, completing the encirclement of the Egyptian Third Army on the East Bank. Some 25,000 Egyptian soldiers and hundreds of tanks were trapped in a hopeless trap, facing the risk of total annihilation. The wind had not only changed direction, it had become a hurricane. From the brink of defeat, the Israeli army now held a resounding military victory in its hands. But this victory pushed the world closer to a global crisis, as the Israeli military encirclement of the Egyptian Third Army tightened by the hour, turning a formidable military force into an isolated pocket facing the threat of total annihilation from hunger and thirst. The regional war in the Middle East rapidly escalated to an unprecedented level of danger. It was no longer a confrontation between Israel and the Arab states. It had become a breathtaking geopolitical chess game. A direct and catastrophic test of wills between the two dominant nuclear superpowers of the world, the United States and the Soviet Union. Throughout the war, neither superpower sat idly by. They were the patrons, the arms suppliers, and the main players behind the belligerents. From the very first days, when the Israeli army suffered unprecedented losses of tanks and aircraft, Prime Minister Golda Meir, in a state of near panic, sent a top-secret and urgent message to Washington. She pleaded for help, like, making it clear that without immediate reinforcements of equipment, the situation could become untenable. At first, the administration of President Richard Nixon, and especially National Security Advisor Henry Kissinger, a master of realpolitik, were hesitant. Kissinger, in the early days, even wanted to bleed Israel a little. He believed that too easy a victory would make Israel arrogant and unwilling to negotiate, while a harder fight would exhaust both sides and make them more receptive to a diplomatic solution brokered by the United States. However, as intelligence reports revealed how serious Israel's losses really were, and more importantly, as the Soviet Union began a large-scale airlift to supply Egypt and Syria from October 10th, Washington realized it could wait no longer. The collapse of their most important strategic ally in the Middle East is unacceptable. On October 12th, President Nixon, beset by the Watergate scandal, pounded the table and gave a decisive order to the Pentagon: send everything that can fly. Operation Nickel Grass officially began. It was one of the largest, most complex strategic military airlift operations in peacetime history. Faced with the refusal of most European NATO allies, except Portugal, to allow American aircraft to land or fly over their airspace for fear of Arab retaliation with oil weapons, the USAF had to establish a direct, extremely daring air bridge across the Atlantic, flying directly from the US East Coast to Israel. For 32 days, they made 567 flights, delivering a huge amount of equipment, more than 22,000 tons of tanks, artillery, Tau anti-tank missiles, the weapon that turned the balance of forces against Arab tanks, ammunition, and advanced electronic warfare equipment to counter Soviet SAM systems. This cargo not only made up for Israel's heavy losses, but also gave them a decisive technological advantage in the counteroffensive phase of the war. It was an unmistakable message to Moscow and the Arab world. The United States would not let Israel fall, seeing its Egyptian ally, from its initial resounding victory, now cornered and in danger of being destroyed, Moscow became extremely alarmed and angry. Soviet leader Leonid Brezhnev, who had pledged support to Sadat, felt humiliated. He sent a series of increasingly stern messages to Nixon, demanding that Israel withdraw to its starting line on October 22nd, the day the first UN ceasefire came into effect. The crisis climaxed on the night of October 24th. The Israeli encirclement of the Egyptian Third Army was completely tightened. Brezhnev sent an urgent and direct letter to Nixon via the hotline. The letter suggested that the United States and the Soviet Union send a joint military force to the area to enforce the ceasefire. But the end of the letter contained an undisguised and dangerous threat. If the United States did not agree to joint action, the Soviet Union might consider unilateral action. American intelligence also gathered alarming information that reinforced this threat. 7 elite Soviet airborne divisions were placed on high alert, ready to deploy. The Soviet military air transport network began to show unusual activity. The Soviet Mediterranean fleet had significantly increased its strength, closing in on the US 6th Fleet. There were even unconfirmed intelligence reports that the Soviet Union might be preparing to transport tactical nuclear weapons to the Egyptian port of Alexandria on a cargo ship. The world was facing a crisis on a scale similar to the Cuban Missile Crisis of 1962. In Washington, Brezhnev's threat set off alarm bells at the highest level. To complicate matters, President Nixon was now completely mired in the Watergate scandal. It was at this time that the Saturday Night Massacre had just occurred, when he fired Special Prosecutor Archibald Cox, leading to the resignations of the Attorney General and Deputy Attorney General. Nixon's power and credibility were at their lowest ebb, and many believed he was not mentally prepared to handle an international crisis of this magnitude. The heavy responsibility fell almost entirely on Henry Kissinger. At midnight, Kissinger called an emergency meeting of the National Security Council, later known as the Special Washington Group, to send a clear, strong, and unmistakable message to Moscow that the United States would not allow Israel to be intimidated, would not accept unilateral Soviet military intervention, and was ready to confront. They made a historic and risky decision. They decided to raise the alert level of the U.S. Armed Forces around the world to DEFCON 3. DEFCON Defense Readiness Condition is a 5-level scale of combat readiness of the U.S. military, with DEFCON 1 being an imminent or already begun nuclear war. DEFCON 3, codenamed Roundhouse, is the highest level of alert in peacetime, second only to the Cuban Missile Crisis. Immediately, B-52 strategic bombers carrying nuclear weapons were ordered to leave their bases, disperse, and be ready to take off. The 6th Fleet in the Mediterranean and other fleets around the world were ordered to be ready for combat. U.S. military bases around the world were put on high alert. The world, unbeknownst to it at the time, was suddenly on the brink of a third world war, a nuclear war. The tough US message, delivered not through words but through military action, was effective. The Soviets, while angry, were also realists. They understood that Washington was not joking. They backed away from the threat of direct confrontation. Instead of military intervention, both superpowers returned to diplomacy, now with greater urgency than ever. Together, they put pressure on the parties involved. The UN Security Council was convened repeatedly. Resolution 338 was passed on October 22nd, demanding an immediate ceasefire and the implementation of Resolution 242. However, this initial ceasefire was quickly broken as the Israeli army continued to tighten the siege. A second resolution, Resolution 339, was passed shortly thereafter, reaffirming the ceasefire. Under intense pressure from its superpower sponsor, the United States, Israel, despite its overwhelming superiority on the battlefield, was forced to accept the ceasefire. Kissinger spoke by telephone to Israeli ambassador Simcha Dinitz, making it clear that if Israel destroyed the Egyptian Third Army, it would have to do so alone, without American support, and would face the consequences of Soviet intervention. Golda Meir reluctantly agreed. However, Israeli troops on the ground, especially those commanded by Ariel Sharon, continued their mopping up operations to improve their strategic position before the guns finally fell silent. This led to the final, bloody, and pointless fighting in the city of Suez. Finally, on October 26th, the guns fell silent on all fronts. The bloodiest, most intense war in the history of the Arab-Israeli conflict came to a temporary end. Not with an absolute military victory for either side on the battlefield, but with the intervention of the superpowers. They pulled both sides back from the brink of mutual destruction, and at the same time pulled the whole world back from the brink of a global nuclear war. When the last shots fell silent, a heavy, almost unnatural silence fell over the still smoking battlefields. The acrid smell of gunpowder and death mingled with the desert air. On the steel fields of the Sinai and the volcanic hills of the Golan, thousands of charred tanks, their turrets torn away, lay like giant steel tombs, testimony to the brutality of the battle. Both sides, exhausted physically and mentally, began the painful task of tallying up their terrible losses. The number of casualties far exceeded that of all previous conflicts combined. The Arabs, mainly Egyptians and Syrians, suffered heavy losses, estimated at 15,000 to 18,000 dead and more than 35,000 wounded. They had lost more than 2,500 tanks and nearly 500 aircraft. But for these populous nations, though painful, it was a price they could bear demographically. On the other hand, for Israel, the casualties, though lower in absolute terms, were a mortal wound for a small country with a population of just over 3 million at the time. Nearly 2,700 soldiers were killed and more than 3,000 were wounded. Nearly every family in Israel had a relative or friend killed or wounded. This casualty rate, if translated into the population of the United States, would be equivalent to the loss of 500,000 Americans in a war that lasted just 3 weeks. Hundreds of Israeli soldiers were taken prisoner, and the fear of their fate and the torture they might endure became a national obsession. Despite a stunning military victory on the battlefield in the final days, surrounding an entire Egyptian army and threatening the Syrian capital, Israel was, according to most historians and later Israeli analysts, the biggest strategic and psychological loser in the 1973 conflict. Win the battle but lose the war is a phrase often used to describe Israel's outcome. The economic damage was a staggering blow. The war cost Israel a huge sum, estimated to be equivalent to a year's worth of gross domestic product, GDP at the time. The economy, which had been booming, was plunged into a deep recession that lasted for years. But the deepest wound, one that would not heal for decades, was mental. The sense of invincibility, pride, and almost absolute confidence that had been the bedrock of Israeli society since 1967 had completely collapsed. In its place was a deep sense of vulnerability, a seething anger, and a complete loss of faith in the leaders, whom they had worshipped as gods. For the first time since the founding of the Jewish state, its survival felt so fragile and threatened. The myth of the all-powerful IDF and the all-knowing Mossad Amman intelligence agency had been shattered. As soon as the ceasefire was signed, wartime solidarity quickly gave way to a wave of public outrage and demands for responsibility. Painful questions were asked in every newspaper, in every coffee shop. Why did this disaster happen? Why were we caught so humiliatingly by surprise? Who is responsible for Hamedal, the omission, or the failure? The word Israelis use to refer to the worst intelligence failure in the country's history. Public pressure, fueled by protests by reservists recently returned from the front who had witnessed the chaos and unpreparedness firsthand, became unstoppable. Golda Meir's government was forced to set up a special commission of inquiry headed by Supreme Court Chief Justice Shimon Agranat. The Agranat Commission, after months of work, collecting hundreds of testimonies and documents, published an interim report in April 1974 that shocked the entire country. The report placed much of the blame on senior military officials who were seen as professional shields. Chief of Staff David Elazar, who had commanded the successful counteroffensive, was held personally responsible for the lack of preparedness and was forced to resign in bitterness and humiliation. Military Intelligence Director Eli Zera and many of his subordinate officers were also dismissed and faced public scorn. However, the report largely exonerated political leaders, including Prime Minister Golda Meir and especially Defense Minister Moshe Dayan. The commission argued that they had acted reasonably on the basis of faulty intelligence they had received from their subordinates. Essentially, the report argued that politicians were victims of military failures. This conclusion caused a political firestorm and public outrage. People could not accept that those with the highest policy responsibility, those with the ultimate decision-making power, could be innocent. Moshe Dayan, the hero with the black eye patch, the symbol of victory in 1967, was now seen as a symbol of complacency, arrogance, and failure. Although Golda Meir's Labor Party narrowly won the post-war elections, public pressure and deep rifts within the party proved too much to overcome. Within months of the report's release, both Prime Minister Golda Meir and Defense Minister Moshe Dayan resigned, ending an era of labor dominance and Israel's founding generation. The Yom Kippur earthquake shook the country's political landscape to its core, paving the way for the rise of the hardline right-wing faction led by Menachem Begin a few years later. On the other side of the canal, by contrast, the atmosphere was completely different. Despite suffering much heavier military losses, the Arab side, and especially Egypt, had achieved a resounding and invaluable political and moral victory. President Anwar Sadat had achieved exactly what he had wanted, and more. The initial success of the offensive and the Egyptian army's resistance to Israeli counterattacks erased the shame of the humiliating defeat of 1967. It demonstrated to Israel and the world that Arab armies were capable of sophisticated planning, absolute secrecy, and effective, courageous fighting. It broke down psychological barriers of fear. The strength and unity of the Arab world, however temporary, was powerfully demonstrated. In addition to Egypt and Syria directly involved in the war, an unprecedented Arab military coalition was formed. Iraq, Jordan, Algeria, Morocco, Sudan, and even Cuba sent troops to the war. Saudi Arabia and Kuwait, with their oil-rich finances, covered most of the war costs for Egypt and Syria and unleashed their powerful oil weapons. Through the war, in the ceasefire and disengagement agreements brokered by Henry Kissinger, Egypt regained full control of the Suez Canal and a strategic strip of land on the east bank of the Sinai Peninsula. The Suez Canal, Egypt's economic lifeline, was reopened. More importantly, Sadat broke the political deadlock. He could now enter negotiations with Israel not as a defeated man begging for peace, but as the Channel Crosser, a leader who had restored honor to his people and to the Arab world, negotiating from a position of strength. Likewise, Syria in the subsequent negotiations also regained the city of Quneitra, albeit destroyed, and a small part of the Golan Heights. The war for the Arab world was a priceless psychological victory, a necessary morale booster. The 1973 Yom Kippur War was more than just another military conflict in a long line of Arab-Israeli wars. It was a seismic event, an irreversible turning point that redrawn the entire political, psychological, and strategic map of the Middle East. It had profound effects on global politics, altered the balance of power, and created complex legacies that still profoundly affect our world today. The 3 weeks of gunfire in October 1973 created aftershocks that lasted for decades. The first, and perhaps most paradoxical legacy, the bloodiest war, paved the way for peace. It may sound contradictory, but this devastating and shocking war was an indispensable precondition for the first historic peace treaty between Israel and an Arab state. The shock of the war taught both sides valuable lessons, shattering the dangerous illusions they had held for years. On the Israeli side, the war completely destroyed the concept of invincibility and absolute security based on military power. They bitterly realized that the permanent occupation of Arab territory, especially Sinai, did not bring security, but, on the contrary, it was the seed of war. The price paid in blood of nearly 3,000 elite sons made Israeli society seriously rethink the doctrine of land for peace. The collapse of the myth of invincibility made them more realistic, more humble, and ready for compromises that they had previously considered unthinkable. For Egypt and the Arab world, the war, especially its early successes, restored national honor and pride that had been deeply wounded by the 1967 defeat. President Anwar Sadat now had the prestige and political standing to do what no previous Arab leader had dared: negotiate directly with Israel. He could sit at the negotiating table not as a defeated man begging for peace, but as a political victor, a man who had proven his strength on the battlefield. It was this new equilibrium, a psychological parody created by the ruins and bloodshed, that paved the way for Anwar Sadat's dramatic and historic visit to Jerusalem in 1977, and culminated in the Camp David Peace Accords of 1979, brokered by US President Jimmy Carter. Without the War of 1973, there would have been no peace in 1979. Legacy 2, the reshaping of the roles of the superpowers and the unique position of the United States in the Middle East. The war clearly demonstrated that no party in the region could wage a large-scale war or achieve a decisive victory without the full support of its superpower sponsor. But more importantly, it led to a tectonic geostrategic shift. Egypt under Sadat, after feeling held back by the Soviet Union and not providing the offensive weapons he desired, made a historic 180-degree turn. He expelled the remaining Soviet advisors, canceled the friendship treaty with Moscow, and turned completely to the United States by eliminating its main rival, the United States. Through Henry Kissinger's tireless shuttle diplomacy, established a near monopoly as the sole influential mediator in the Middle East, a position it maintained for decades to come. By contrast, Israel, realizing its fragility and its vital dependence on the American Nickel-Grass air bridge, became even more tightly woven into Washington's orbit. The relationship between the two countries transformed from a mere collaboration into an inseparable strategic alliance, with Israel receiving huge annual military and economic aid packages, transforming the IDF into one of the best-equipped armies in the world. But perhaps the most lasting and shocking legacy of the 1973 war, one that changed the daily lives of billions of people on the planet, was the creation and first successful use of a new weapon, one more powerful than tanks and airplanes: the weapon of oil. In retaliation for the West's, and especially the United States, support for Israel in the Nickel-Grass airlift, the Arab nations of the Organization of the Petroleum Exporting Countries, OPEC, led by the powerful King Faisal of Saudi Arabia, decided to take action. On October 17, 1973, they announced monthly oil production cuts and imposed a total oil embargo on the United States, the Netherlands for allowing American planes to use their bases, and several other countries they considered hostile. This action triggered the first global energy crisis, an economic shock that shook the industrial world to its foundations. The price of crude oil on world markets skyrocketed from about $3 a barrel before the war to $12 a barrel in just a few months, a 400% increase. The advanced industrial economies of the West, built on cheap and abundant energy from the Middle East, were thrown into disarray. Hyperinflation, stagnant economic growth, creating a new phenomenon called stagflation, and widespread energy shortages became realities. The embargo, which lasted from October 1973 to March 1974, demonstrated beyond doubt that the stability of the Middle East was no longer a regional issue, but had a direct and profound impact on the prosperity of the entire world economy. For the first time, Arab states had a powerful tool to exert political pressure on the West to adopt a more balanced policy on the Israeli-Palestinian issue. Global geopolitical power shifted significantly toward the oil-producing states. The Yom Kippur War was a tragedy, a costly lesson written in blood about the dangers of arrogance, complacency, and misjudging one's opponent. It was a reminder that in complex conflicts, there is no absolute victory, and that peace, however fragile, can only be achieved through respect, dialogue, and the recognition of each other's legitimate pain and aspirations. From the ashes of the 1973 war, a new, more complex, unpredictable, and forever changed Middle East was born. What do you think was the greatest lesson from the 1973 Yom Kippur War? Was it the failure of intelligence, the price of complacency, the power of oil weapons, or the paradox that the most devastating war paved the way for peace? Leave your thoughts in the comments. And don't forget to subscribe to the channel to continue following the next chapters in the complex and tumultuous history of Middle East conflict.